It was the sort of fog one felt ought to be poetic, but was mostly clammy. An intrusive October drizzle hung in the hedgerows, lending to the village of Steeple Fenchurch that singularly English blend of mild squalor and brooding charm. The ancient sign of the Horse and Hound creaked dismally, and the windows of the local photography studio, Woolstone's pictorial portraits, were dark. It was, incidentally, from the interior of that same studio that Mr. Ambrose Woolstone, sometime war photographer, and resident eccentric of the parish, was discovered by Miss Hildegard Stout, village busybody, full of unassailable virtue and unplucked widowhood, to be lying quite dead upon the floor of his darkroom, a coil of photographic cable around his neck, and a shattered glass plate negative at his side. Miss Stout, who had called only to inquire about a long-overdue portrait of her Pomeranian, made haste to summon the vicar, the constable, and in something of a flight of imagination, the station-master's wife, who was known to have once read a detective novel and thus might, it was assumed, possess a relevant perspective. By the time Lord Peter Wimsey arrived, quite uninvited but not unwelcome, some 3 days later, the suicide was all but signed, sealed, and certified in triplicate. The coroner, who liked his lunch early, had agreed that the matter was plainly self-inflicted. Mr. Woolstone had been peculiar for years, and a man who spent his evenings discussing exposure times and spectral emulsions was surely bound to turn the lens inward eventually. "Well, it's dashed inconvenient of him," Wimsey remarked, stepping lightly over the threshold of the studio with that oddly balletic gait of his, half Eton and half Harlequin. The only man in the county who could reproduce an Edwardian daguerreotype without making the baby resemble a tuba, and he must go and throttle himself on the eve of the Women's Institute calendar. Shocking disregard for posterity, Chief. Inspector Parker, who had been dragged in from London and was none too pleased about it, merely grunted and gestured toward the darkroom. Wimsey paused, turning his head with an exaggerated theatricality, as though sniffing out melodrama. "You know, Charles, there's something frightfully impolite about dying in a darkroom, rather like dying in church. It suggests one wasn't quite finished." "He'd written no note," Parker said, brushing lint from his sleeve. "But there's no sign of forced entry. The door was bolted from the inside and nothing's been taken. We found his spectacles tucked beside the developer tray. Everything points to deliberate action." "Except the glass plate," Wimsey murmured, bending down to inspect the shattered negative, the corners of which had been swept into an envelope marked "Client, Parnell, Miss A." He turned the envelope delicately in gloved fingers. "Rather a shame. And such a wonderfully Gothic name, Miss A. Parnell. Sounds like the sort of woman who dies mysteriously in Italian gardens." "She's a local girl," Parker supplied. "Teaches piano to the vicar's son and assists at the post office on Saturdays. No fortune, no history of romance, and quite dull by all accounts." "Even better," said Wimsey, his eyes twinkling behind his monocle. "Dull girls in murder stories are never quite what they seem. Have you seen the interior?" "Yes. It's drearier than a Quaker picnic, except—" Parker hesitated. "There is one odd thing." Wimsey's interest sharpened like a scalpel. "There's a half-developed photograph still in the fixative," Parker said. "The plate was only just starting to resolve when the constable blundered in and exposed it to the light. What little remains is, well, it's difficult to say. Possibly a double exposure. There's a face, but also what looks like," he hesitated again, "a church tower. At an angle." Wimsey let out a delighted chuckle. "A ghostly face and a toppling steeple? Charles, if we aren't very careful, this may develop into something positively Brontean. I shall be forced to quote Wuthering Heights and wear high collars." "You always wear high collars." "True," said Wimsey, "and very sensibly so. Now then, I must ask the usual tedious questions. Who found the body? Who was the last to see our deceased shutter-snapper alive? And who profits by his untimely tumble into the developer?" Parker exhaled. "Miss Stout found him, though she insists he was alive when she passed by that morning, claims she heard him whistling Greensleeves, but she also claims her cat speaks German, so make of that what you will. And next of kin? None that we can find. He had no family, only a tenant in the cottage behind the studio. Quiet fellow, Writes articles for photography magazines and talks about shadows a lot. Whimsy smirked. Ah, the shadow knows. Parker frowned. You don't think there's more to it? Lord Peter straightened, dusting off his cuffs with meticulous care. My dear Charles, when a man dies alone in a locked darkroom, beside a broken negative and an envelope marked with a mysterious name, well, even a confirmed suicide starts to resemble something rather more theatrical. And, you know I can never resist the theatre. He paused and glanced once more toward the back of the studio. Besides, he added lightly, I've always believed that photographs lie only in ways their owners permit, and this one I think may have told the truth a little too clearly. And, with that, Lord Peter Wimsey smiled faintly, as though he already heard the second act beginning to stir behind the curtain. The studio smelled of vinegar and slow decay. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had made a minor study of the peculiar odours of English interiors, filed it away as the scent of neglect, tinged with hyposulfite of soda and the faintest trace of lavender polish, as though someone had tried a trifle too late to impose domestic order upon artistic squalor. It was still early, and the village had not yet stirred into full wakefulness, though the vicarage chimney puffed discreetly in the distance, and a hopeful cat rubbed itself along the sill of Woolstone's front room. Whimsy stood beside the fireplace, inspecting the mantelpiece with that deliberate casualness which, in less polished hands, might be mistaken for dithering. There's always something odd about a man who doesn't photograph himself, he murmured. Parker, who had followed him in with a bundle of reports under his arm and an expression that implied he'd rather be elsewhere, raised a brow. What's that? No portraits of our late Mr. Woolstone in sight, Whimsy said, gesturing at the cluster of framed works, women in stiff collars, squirming children in sailor suits, a barking dog mid-snarl. The man made his living embalming other people's visages, but no self-regard in evidence. Either modesty, guilt, or possibly he simply had a damned unfortunate face. He had a moustache like a walrus and a cast in one eye, Parker supplied. There you are, then, said Whimsy with satisfaction. A motive for concealment, if ever there was one. Now let's pay our respects to the tenant, shall we? The one who lives round the back and contemplates shadows. They made their way along a narrow side path hedged with stubborn laurels. A meagre door led to what had once been a stable, now converted into lodgings. Parker knocked with perfunctory knuckles, and after a moment it opened to reveal a tall, underfed figure in an ink-stained cardigan and house slippers. Mr. Blount, said Whimsy cheerily, terribly sorry to intrude on your privacy. Lord Peter Wimsey, this is Chief Inspector Parker. May we beg a few minutes of your valuable, shadow-infused time? Mr. Blount blinked at them. He was pale in a way that suggested milk rather than tragedy, and his hair was already thinning into monastic austerity. I suppose you've come about Ambrose, he said, stepping aside without further ceremony. I expected someone eventually. The interior was bookish, bare and immaculate, unlike Woolstone's studio, which had possessed the haphazard clutter of a man who both created and abandoned in equal measure. Whimsy noticed a stack of the amateur photographer on the writing desk and a camera lens cap on the windowsill, carefully aligned with the curtain hem. You knew him well? Asked Parker, taking out his notebook. As well as anyone did, said Blount. He was a private man, odd habits, spoke to himself, fiddled with old photographic techniques, liked things done in silence. Quarrels? Whimsy asked. Not between us. Blount frowned. But there was something bothering him these past few weeks. He seemed afraid, jumped at noises, kept the dark room locked even when he wasn't in it. And he'd mutter about someone coming back, but wouldn't say who. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Parker. Coming back from where? Blount shook his head. He didn't say, just she's coming back. Or sometimes she knows. It might have been guilt. He spoke of an old accident, said it happened years ago, and this place remembers. Did he ever mention a Miss A. Parnell? Whimsy asked gently. Blount hesitated. Only once. I'd come in through the back and startled him. He was holding a glass plate. He dropped it, swore under his breath and said something about a damned inconvenient ghost, then muttered Miss Parnell's name and shut himself in the dark room. Whimsy sat forward slightly. Did he mean ghost literally, do you think? Blount looked uncomfortable. I think he was tired. I know he hadn't been sleeping. There was a pause. You didn't hear anything unusual the night before he died, Parker asked. Only the dog barking, that stray that lurks by the grocer's. Woolstone went out briefly. I heard the gate creak, maybe 10 or 11. Then, silence. Whimsy stood and wandered over to the desk. Forgive me, do you write professionally? Articles, yes. On optics. I review equipment occasionally. Nothing glamorous. No correspondence with Mr. Woolstone. No joint ventures. None, said Blount. We were more tenants than friends. Whimsy nodded and thanked him. Outside he turned to Parker. A rather careful man, our Mr. Blount. Doesn't strike me as the type to strangle his landlord with photographic cable. But then who does? He's got no motive, Parker said, and no signs of struggle. True, but it does seem our dearly departed had begun to fear something, or someone. The she is interesting, isn't it? And how delightfully dramatic, a man terrified of a returning woman, whether living or dead. They walked the short distance to the vicarage, a handsome Georgian affair smelling of beeswax and theology. The Reverend Goodfellow greeted them with slightly distracted warmth, ushering them into a study cluttered with sermon drafts and tea things. We understand your son was one of the last to hear Mr. Woolstone alive, Whimsy said. Yes, Toby was meant to have his photograph taken that morning, a birthday present for his grandmother. He came back rather cross. A gangly adolescent was produced, who gave his statements with adolescent resentment. He was late, said Toby, and he was angry when he came out, slammed the door. I'd been sitting outside on the bench, and I heard him shout at someone. Inside the studio, a woman. A woman? Parker looked up. Did you see her? No, but I heard her voice, sort of whispery, like she was trying to keep calm. He said something like, "You can't blame me forever." And she said, "I've seen the proof." Then the door slammed and he stomped off. That was around 9:30. Whimsy's eyebrows arched. Fascinating. And you're sure it was a woman? Toby nodded. Definitely. Not old, either. Outside, as they strolled toward the post office, where Miss Parnell worked Saturdays, Whimsy spoke quietly. So, our suicide quarreled with an unknown woman the morning he died. The tenant hears him speak of a returning female. A broken plate marked with a woman's name, and the photograph left in the fixative, possibly ruined by the constable, shows a face and a leaning church tower. Are you entertained yet, Charles? Parker grunted. I'd like some names to go with these ghosts and innuendos. Patience, said Whimsy cheerfully. We're developing nicely. The postmistress, a red-cheeked woman with military posture and a tight chignon, was pleased to speak of Miss Parnell. Quiet, polite, very musical. Lost her mother last year. Came to live with her aunt, Miss Fosdyke, the one who keeps the... Yellow Cat works hard, never late. Was she acquainted with Mr. Woolstone? Asked Parker. Oh yes, he took her photograph 2 months ago. Lovely portrait, she said, but then, well, she never collected it. Said something in it upset her. She ever speak of him in private? Whimsy asked. The postmistress pursed her lips. She told me once, only once, that he was not the man he claimed to be. Whimsy gave her a sharp look. How do you mean? She wouldn't explain, she said primly. Just said he had another name once and another face long ago. Did she mention where she'd seen it? No, only said the photograph made her remember. Whimsy said nothing for a moment. Then he straightened his cuffs. I think, Charles, he murmured, that we must speak to Miss Parnell very soon. And as the door shut quietly behind them, the sky above Steeple Fenchurch darkened slightly, as though preparing for a more thorough examination of shadows. Miss Alice Parnell lived with her aunt in a house that appeared to have been assembled from a series of miscalculations, leaning slightly to the right, shuttered in permanent indecision, and surrounded by hollyhocks that looked vaguely ashamed of themselves. When Miss Fosdyke opened the door, her expression was that of a woman surprised in the act of being precisely what one had assumed, formidable, unsympathetic, and determined to prevent scandal at all costs. Miss Parnell is unwell, she said, flatly, and attempted to shut the door with the prim finality of a retired governess dismissing a boarder. Whimsy, who had made a study of doors and those who guarded them, caught the edge delicately with the handle of his cane. "Then allow me to be a tonic, Miss Fosdyke. I flatter myself I am sometimes good for the circulation. Lord Peter Whimsy, perhaps you've heard of me?" She had. A flicker passed through her face, part annoyance, part calculation. "My niece is resting, but I suppose if you must—" "I'm afraid I must," said Whimsy, and entered without another invitation, pausing just long enough to let Parker follow and tip his hat with professional gravity. The parlour was dark, despite the time of day, the curtains drawn in sympathy with Miss Parnell's condition. She sat in a high-backed chair like a portrait unwilling to be painted, hands knotted in her lap, her complexion pale but not wan. A girl, one felt, who had taken a great deal of care not to cry. "You saw the body," she said, before either man had spoken. Her voice was even, with a low contralto resonance that suggested she might once have sung in better rooms than this. Whimsy sat across from her with feline delicacy. "I did, and very neatly arranged it was. Gas, efficient, if unsubtle. One always wonders what the last negative truly captures, don't you find?" She met his gaze. "I told him not to go back to the studio. Why? Because it frightened him, and because it frightened me. He said he kept seeing something, just at the edge of the glass plates, a shadow, a face that wasn't supposed to be there." "But that's nonsense," said Miss Fosdyke sharply from behind them. "Photographs do not hold spirits. Alice has been overwrought ever since that foolish sitting." Whimsy didn't turn. "Tell me about the photograph you never collected." There was a pause. Then Miss Parnell said, "He called me back weeks later. Said he'd developed something by accident. Said it was a double exposure, but wrong." He looked afraid. "May I ask, what did you see?" She hesitated, then, "A girl, a little older than me, in the background near the window. It was faint, but there. Her eyes—" She broke off. "I thought I'd seen her before." "Not in real life?" "In a photograph," she said slowly. "Years ago, in my mother's album. It was a picture of a village fete before I was born, but the girl standing near the church tower, it was the same face, only the eyes were older this time." Miss Fosdyke made a dismissive sound. "Coincidence. Photography is full of errors." "No," said Miss Parnell more firmly than before. "It wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate. That face wasn't there when he took my picture." Parker leaned forward. "Do you still have the album?" "No, it disappeared after Mother died. I think Ambrose had it." Whimsy stood. "Then I should be delighted to go searching. Tell me, did Mr. Woolstone ever go by another name?" Miss Parnell looked surprised. "Yes. When I was a child, he was called Ambrose Venn. I only realized who he was after that photograph. He used to visit my parents. There was some falling out. I wasn't told why." Whimsy smiled faintly. "A man with two names and one fearsome reputation. Thank you, Miss Parnell. That has been very enlightening." They left to the sound of the house clicking shut behind them. In the street, Parker exhaled. "Ambrose Venn. I'll run the name through the older files. If he changed it, it may have been for a reason." "No doubt," said Whimsy. "And I suspect our Miss Parnell has stumbled into a rather long-delayed reckoning. But let's see if we can speed things along." They returned to the studio. The constable posted outside had been replaced by a man reading Punch and looking guilty about it. Inside, the air was thick with chemicals and disapproval. Whimsy began poking through drawers with that particular blend of irreverence and delicacy that made policemen nervous and butlers suicidal. Within 10 minutes, he located a false bottom in the tall cabinet near the enlarger and produced a bundle of yellowed envelopes, secured with a shoelace and smelling faintly of mildew. "Albums are bulky," he remarked, "but negatives are eternal. Look here, Charles." Parker peered over. Each envelope bore dates and brief labels. Fete 1910, Parnell House Garden, Rose in Blue Dress, duplicate. The latter was marked in darker ink, Do Not Destroy. They took the bundle to the table under the inspection lamp. Whimsy selected the Fete negative and slid it into the viewer. The image flickered into life. A blurred fairground scene, bunting, a maypole, villagers captured mid-laughter. And there, just right of center, near a leaning church tower, stood a girl in a dark dress. Her features were unmistakable, solemn, slightly sharp, with a piercing gaze that seemed incongruous amidst the gaiety around her. "The same face," said Parker. "You think this is the woman Miss Parnell saw in her own photo?" "Quite." "And if this young woman was known to Woolston, when he was still then it suggests a secret he was trying to bury. Perhaps a guilt that the photograph, rather inconveniently, decided to preserve." Parker leaned in. "We should speak to the vicar. See who organized that fete in 1910. Whimsy smiled. "You take the church. I'll pay a call to the Woolstone. Morgue, his financial affairs, his letters, his dusty little secrets. I'm curious whether the past paid him a visit before the gas took him." They parted ways, Whimsy retreating to the back office where Woolstone had kept his ledgers, and Parker to the church. Within the hour, Parker returned with a face like someone who'd just remembered the name of a song that had eluded him all week. "She was real," he said. "The girl in the photograph, her name was Rosamond Ferrars, a ward of the vicar's cousin, came to live here in 1909. Pretty, quiet, musically inclined. Died the following year. Accident, apparently. Fell into the river near the mill. They never recovered the body." Whimsy looked up from the letters he was scanning. "And our man Venn was seen with her frequently, some talk of impropriety. Then he left the village in a hurry. Changed his name not long after. The vicar was vague, but I saw the old parish notice. There was an inquest. Drowned while walking alone at dusk." Whimsy tapped his fingers on the desk. "She returns in a photograph. He panics. The niece begins to ask questions. The past, inconvenient, unwanted, begins to develop, you might say, in the fixative tray of conscience." He opened a final envelope and froze. It contained a note, hastily scribbled, unsigned. "She said she forgave me. But that face, it knows. I tried to destroy it. It came back. There's a crack in the glass and she watches through it. If Alice sees, she'll remember. I didn't mean to." Whimsy let out a low whistle. He was unraveling. Parker nodded. "But the question is, did someone give him a push?" "Indeed." Whimsy stood and reached for his coat. "Come, Charles, I think we've glimpsed the edge of the plate. Let's see who else has their fingerprints on the emulsion." And as they stepped out once more into the long, grey light of afternoon, Steeple Fenchurch, polite and pious, watched them with its windows tightly shuttered, like an old photograph that had begun at last to fade. The postmistress, Mrs. Minna Fellows, looked up from a tray of battered envelopes with the suspicious air of one who does not approve of unannounced nobility. She was a woman whose spectacles were perpetually steamed with indignation, and who regarded stamps with the sanctity of relics. "I can't go giving out information," she said, not without relish, not without cause, "and I've no reason to believe you're not from one of those scandal sheets. They came once, you know, from the People's Gazette. Wretched types, wanted to know about the bishop's gout." "I assure you," said Whimsy, laying a banknote on the counter with the air of a conjurer revealing a previously non-existent dove, "we are strictly interested in deceased photographers and the ghosts that haunt their filing cabinets. The bishop's bunion, while no doubt of theological interest, remains outside our remit." Parker behind him coughed into his collar. Mrs. Fellows eyed the note as if it might bite, then tucked it into her register with unhurried dignity. "Well then, if it's Mr. Woolston's post you're after, I dare say there wasn't much. Never any family letters, none that I saw. Once a year something in heavy brown paper from a place in Clerkenwell, marked developing supplies, though what might need so much arsenic and mercury I don't like to think." "Nor do I," murmured Whimsy. "Any personal correspondence?" The postmistress pursed her lips. For the past 6 months, only one regular letter, always the same hand, came on a Thursday, postmarked from Harrow-on-the-Hill. Whimsy glanced at Parker. "Did you happen to note the name?" Mrs. Fellows sniffed. "No, but the envelopes were pale blue. Stationery shop on St. Margaret's Terrace used to carry them. You can't get that colour since the war. Too frivolous." "And a frivolous hand, would you say?" "Fussy. Loops. And flourishes. Rather like a music teacher's." They thanked her and departed before she could begin a disquisition on the decline of proper penmanship. Outside, the wind had freshened and the hedgerows shivered with the whispering of half-forgotten secrets. "Letters from Harrow," said Parker, adjusting his collar. "I'll get our people to trace recent residents with connections to Venn, if that was the name he used." "Quite," said Wimsey, thoughtful. "But I think I'd rather like to meet the vicar first. He presided over Miss Ferrers' inquest, which is already a point against him. And I find that clergymen, when pressed, have a charming way of revealing the very sins they most wish to conceal." St. Apollinaris stood at the edge of the village like an elderly juror who sat through too many murder trials, pious, exhausted, and leaning slightly to one side. The vicar, Reverend Simcox, received them with all the warmth of a man who had recently mislaid a sermon and suspected his visitor of theft. "I did conduct the inquest, yes," he said, after some hesitant prompting. "It was distressing. A promising young girl, Miss Ferrers. Tragic accident." Wimsey studied the Reverend's fingers, which tapped the edge of a teacup like a man recalling a nervous habit. "Did you know her well?" "I had spoken with her. She was often at the church, organ lessons, sweet-tempered. But I won't. Say fanciful, precisely. Thoughtful. The kind of girl who reads poetry and stares at lakes. The sort, if you take my meaning, who can step too close to the edge of a thing and forget it isn't art." Wimsey let the silence settle before asking, "And Venn?" The vicar stiffened. "A brash young man, talented with the camera, no doubt. But there were whispers. Mrs. Ferrers, Rosamond's guardian, disliked him intensely. I confess I had to ask him not to return." "Why?" "There was an incident, a photograph he took, unauthorized. It caused considerable upset." Wimsey's brows lifted. "You mean something improper?" No, said the vicar hastily. "Nothing indecent, only unsettling. Rosamond never said as much, but I believe she felt violated, exposed." Parker stirred. "What sort of photograph was it?" The vicar hesitated. "I never saw it, only that it was taken one Sunday after service. She hadn't posed for it, didn't know he'd used the lens, said it wasn't her face. That's what stayed with me." "It isn't my face." Wimsey sat back. "Ah. And she fell, soon after?" "Yes, 2 weeks. Dusk near the mill pond. Left her music satchel on the grass. They said she must have slipped. But it was dry that day and she could swim." He closed his eyes briefly, as if to shut out the dissonance. Wimsey rose. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been most precise, which is the next best thing to truthful. If I might suggest a small favor, could I inspect the parish archives?" The vicar looked startled. "For what purpose?" "To find the ghosts of forgotten girls. I understand they tend to leave their initials in choir rosters and church registers." It was mid-afternoon when they reached the vestry. Wimsey, perched beside the dusty parish volumes, examined the ledger for 1910. There it was, Miss R. Ferrers, organ pupil, hymn preparation, offertory arrangement. Neat, exact, unremarkable. Beside it, in the vicar's own hand, Miss Ferrers, excused from duties after distressing personal incident. See note to follow. Wimsey flipped the page. The note was brief and in a different ink. Parish advised not to discuss the photograph taken 12th of August. Negative destroyed at families. "Request, but it wasn't," said Wimsey softly. "It wasn't." As they exited, Parker's expression was grim. "So he took a photograph of her. Something was wrong with it. She claimed it wasn't her face. 2 weeks later, she dies. And her guardian has the negative destroyed. Except it wasn't." "Exactly," said Wimsey. "Now consider this. 20 years later, Woolstone or Venn takes another portrait of Miss Parnell, and that same face appears again. Not merely a trick of exposure. An image that re-emerges against time and technique." Parker shook his head. "But it can't be supernatural. There has to be a rational explanation." "Oh, I entirely agree," said Wimsey. "But for the moment, let's not destroy the delicious possibility that someone somewhere is using photographs to do what poison and pistols cannot, create fear, and possibly nudge the guilty toward the gas tap." As they crossed the green toward the inn, a figure detached itself from a cluster of ivy by the war memorial. Miss Parnell, no hat, no gloves, a thin scarf clutched about her neck as if it Might protect against regret. I found something, she said breathlessly. In one of the old trunks in the attic. It's the original print, the one of me. I never showed it to anyone. But now I think it's the same woman. She pressed it into Whimsy's hands. The image was dim and slightly smudged at the edges, but the face in the upper window was undeniable. Sharp-featured, dark-eyed, and faintly smiling, with that peculiar stillness that comes only from long acquaintance with death. Parker exhaled. So she's real, not a trick of memory. No, said Whimsy. Not memory, something far more meticulous and more deliberate. Miss Parnell looked from one to the other. Do you think he put it there? Deliberately? Ambrose? Whimsy did not answer. Instead, he held the photograph to the light and turned it slowly with gloved fingers. What I think, Miss Parnell, he said at last, is that someone has a very long memory indeed, and a very sharp eye for detail. They stood for a moment in the growing chill, the shadows stretching like long, accusatory fingers across the green. Then Whimsy folded the photograph carefully, as though it might still whisper its secrets to someone better attuned. Come, Charles, he said. We've caught a glimpse of the ghost. Let's see if we can trace the hand that raised her. Whimsy said little as they walked back toward the inn, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot, punctuated only by the occasional muttering of the wind through the eaves. Parker knew better than to interrupt his companion's reverie. Whimsy's silences were rarely idle. The photograph had stirred something, perhaps recognition, perhaps merely the contours of a theory half-formed. At the Swan and Trumpet, the parlour fire had been lit, and the scent of peat and tobacco hung in the air like a memory too comfortable to dislodge. Miss Parnell sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, clutching her cup of tea with both hands. Her fingers, Parker noticed, were trembling just enough to set the china rattling. I've gone through every other photograph Ambrose gave me, she said, glancing up. There's nothing strange in any of them, just that one. Whimsy took the cup from her gently and set it on the table. He sat opposite, steepling his fingers. Tell me again, he said. When did Ambrose give you this print? She hesitated. Late September. He'd taken several exposures, portraits of me in the window, some of the garden. He sent a parcel by post, and this was in it. I thought he must have meant it as a joke, some trick of the light. But the longer I looked... You began to see it wasn't a trick, Whimsy finished. And you didn't think to ask him? I did, I wrote, no reply. And after that, I saw him only once more, in November, at the village fete. He'd set up a small booth, selling old prints and a few new ones. When I approached, he looked as though he didn't recognize me, or pretended not to. I asked him about the photograph, and he said... She paused, swallowing. He said, it isn't her, it never was. Then he packed up his things and left before the fete ended. A week later, he was dead. There was a long silence. Parker reached for the photograph, examining the woman in the window again. Something about the eyes, deep-set, quietly mocking, almost serene, troubled him. It was the kind of face one might find on a saint's effigy, carved in alabaster, utterly detached from the warmth of life. I think, said Whimsy slowly, that Mr. Ambrose Venn, or Woolstone, or whatever he last called himself, had begun to see a pattern. He might even have seen it long ago, but for some reason he chose to confront it again. That choice cost him dearly. He rose, took the photograph, and placed it gently between the pages of his notebook. I want you to rest. Miss Parnell, you've done enough for now. We shall have questions later, of course, but tonight you must leave the ghosts to us. Once she had retired, Whimsy poured himself a glass of port and sat cross-legged on the hearthrug, his gaze fixed on the flames. Charles, he said, we must locate the original negatives. Parker frowned. You think he kept them? I think he kept something. If not the negatives, then a diary, a log. He was an archivist of faces, a man who catalogued, humanity one shutter click at a time. Such men rarely discard their work without reason. He moved about a great deal, Parker pointed out. Even the landlord says he was something of a ghost himself. Then we traced the trail backward. We know he had something posted from Clerkenwell, a parcel of photographic supplies. There may be records, and the pale blue letters from Harrow, one per week, We must find the sender. There's a motive behind them, or at least a connection. Parker made a note. And what of the girl? Rosamond Ferrers. The resemblance is too strong to be coincidence. Precisely, said Whimsy. Which is why tomorrow we pay a call to Miss Ferrers' guardian. If she still resides in the village, I fancy she might have something to say. Or perhaps, more tellingly, something she refuses to say. Parker glanced at the mantel clock. Too late to start tonight. Indeed, Whimsy replied, rising, but not too late for one more question. He went to his valise and removed a small folder containing the list the postmistress had so grudgingly supplied, postmarked letters to Woolstone. There, among the half-dozen, was one curious detail. The Harrow sender never included a return address, only initials EM, Whimsy murmured, and not a soul in this parish with matching initials so far as I've seen. Unless, of course. He stopped short. The fire crackled in the grate. Parker waited. Unless the sender wasn't a local at all, but someone with a shared memory, someone who recognized what had been seen once and was now being seen again, he folded the paper, eyes narrowing. Sleep well, Charles. We may have our answer before nightfall tomorrow. Morning broke wet and grey, the sort of drab English day that feels designed to hide truths beneath its mist. By 9 they were knocking on the door of Black Gables, the Ferrers' home, an ivy-strangled Georgian pile that gave off an air of cultivated mourning. The door was opened by a maid in a plain grey dress. She looked at them with suspicion until Whimsy handed her his card. Her brow furrowed at the Viscount's name, but she showed them into a parlour heavy with damask and doilies. Mrs. Ferrers entered some minutes later, a thin woman with rigid posture, her silver hair swept into a bun so severe it might have been secured with a court order. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her voice carried the clipped cadences of someone who had practiced restraint. For decades, you wish to speak of Rosamond, she said without preamble, and of Mr. Woolstone. I confess I fail to see the connection. Whimsy inclined his head. It concerns a photograph, madam, taken of a young woman, Miss Parnell. But what emerged on the plate was not her likeness. It was someone else's. Someone long dead. Mrs. Ferrers did not blink. And you believe that to be Rosamond? I believe, said Whimsy carefully, that Mr. Woolstone believed it, and that someone else 20 years ago believed it strongly enough to ensure the negative of a certain photograph was destroyed. She drew herself up. My niece's death was ruled accidental. I know, but there are accidents, he said softly, and there are silencings. For a moment something flickered behind her eyes, fear perhaps or memory. Then her lips thinned. There was a photograph. He took it without her knowledge. It frightened her. She came to me weeping, said the face wasn't hers. That it looked like someone else. I confronted him. He laughed, said it was a flaw in the lens. I made him swear to burn the plate. I never trusted him again. And did he? Parker asked. I don't know, she said flatly. But my niece died, and I have spent 20 years grieving. I will not reopen that wound to satisfy some Gothic fantasy. Whimsy rose. Thank you. One final question. Do you know anyone, perhaps from Harrow, who signed their letters E.M.? She hesitated. There was an Eleanor Martin, Rosamond's school friend. They wrote often, but Eleanor moved to Canada shortly after the funeral. Whimsy nodded. That, I think, is a lead worth following. As they left, Parker glanced back at the house. You believe her? I believe she is tired, said Whimsy. And when people are tired, they sometimes confuse omission with honesty. Come, Charles, we must send a wire to Harrow and Clerkenwell. Parker looked puzzled. Clerkenwell? Yes. The supplier. With luck, they'll tell us where Mr. Woolstone last had his prints developed. And if they don't? Whimsy smiled thinly. Then we dig deeper. Somewhere, in all these layers of forgotten faces, one man kept looking for the truth. Let's make sure we find it before someone ensures we never look again. The train from Hertfordshire to London trundled through a landscape sodden with rain fields swimming in a muddy fug, telegraph poles flickering past like skeletal sentinels. Whimsy sat with a folded newspaper on his lap, unread. Across from him, Parker reviewed the notes in his black notebook with a frown of habitual concentration. Neither had spoken for several minutes. "I've been thinking," said Parker at last, "about that photograph, the one Miss Parnell received. It wasn't simply an accidental double exposure. You and I have both seen hundreds of those in our time. This was deliberate." "Yes," said Wimsey, toying absently with his monocle. "Too deliberate, perhaps. What troubles me most, Charles, is not what was added to the photograph, but what may have been missing." Parker looked up. "Negative space," Wimsey mused. "Every photographer, every good one, knows that what is absent from a frame can say more than what is present. Composition, as Ambrose might have said, is a study in implication." They arrived at King's Cross just before noon, making their way first to Clerkenwell, to the narrow frontage of a photography supply shop whose name, Godwin and Bletchley, was discreetly embossed in gilt upon smoked glass. The interior was lined with wooden cabinets, stained a dark walnut, each drawer labelled in impeccable copperplate: sodium thiosulfate, collodion, silver nitrate, carbon tissue. A thin, clerical man emerged from the back, spectacles perched so low on his nose as to render them seemingly decorative. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Wimsey handed over a calling card. "Lord Peter Wimsey. I'm inquiring about a former client of yours, Ambrose Venn, also known as Woolstone. I believe he ordered supplies from this establishment up to 6 weeks ago." The man brightened. "Ah, yes, Mr. Woolstone. Rather old-fashioned in his tastes. Used glass plates longer than most. He ordered a fresh box of silver bromide emulsions just before the news." "Did he collect in person?" "No, had them sent on. Always did. Said he preferred not to leave the dark room when he could help it." Wimsey leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever return work for processing?" "On rare occasions, when he didn't trust his own handling of a particular exposure. He was working on something rather peculiar. Last time, we had a half-dozen plates come in that he marked 'Do not touch' until developed by instructions. Sent them with a note asking for complete discretion. Do you still have those plates?" The man's eyes widened. "Well, we did. But he collected them, or rather, someone did, about a fortnight before he died." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "Someone?" "Yes. A young woman. Said she was collecting them on his behalf. Had a note signed by him, too." It matched his previous hand, looked official. Parker was already reaching for his notepad. "Did you get her name?" "No." She didn't offer it. Wimsey's voice remained light, but his eyes had gone very still. "Would you know her? Again, if you saw her?" The clerk looked uncertain. "Plain sort, brown hair, bobbed, quiet, wore gloves. I remember the gloves, lavender suede. Unusual colour." "Lavender," Wimsey repeated. "Not a common shade." "Exactly," said the man, pleased. "Odd the details you remember, isn't it?" "We depend upon them," Wimsey said gravely. "Thank you. You've been extraordinarily helpful. If any further correspondence arrives from Mr. Venn's estate, or any more young ladies with gloves, you'll be good enough to let us know?" They left the shop in silence, the drizzle having congealed into proper rain. Wimsey's collar was soon soaked. "What do you make of it?" Parker asked as they hailed a cab. "She wasn't local," said Wimsey. "No village girl owns lavender gloves, which means she was either from London or made to look as though she were." The cab deposited them at the British Library, where Wimsey requested a file Parker had not expected: the 1905 records of a legal dispute between the Ferrers estate and a certain J. Martin of Harrow-on-the-Hill. It took some time to locate, but the clerks eventually emerged with a dusty folder and left them alone in the reading room. "Aha," Wimsey murmured, leafing through the yellowed pages. "Eleanor Martin, elder sister to John Martin. Their family. Held a minor share in a printing press, later absorbed by Ferrers Holdings in 1911. There was a small inheritance dispute. Nothing grand, but Eleanor was paid off, discreetly one might say, and vanished into polite obscurity." Parker scanned the pages. "But no criminal charge, no obvious connection to Ambrose Venn." "Not yet," Wimsey agreed. "But Eleanor Martin had a daughter, if I remember the school records, born in 1910, name not listed, possibly adopted or fostered under another name. The initials EM again? Possibly. Whimsy's fingers tapped the file. But let's assume for a moment the daughter is alive, that she or Eleanor herself is the one who contacted Ambrose. The letters began months ago. What if the photograph stirred some old recognition, an inheritance perhaps, or a guilt buried? Too long? What if Ambrose was warned not to pursue it and did so anyway? He's dead now, Parker said, and the girl who collected the plates may be the key to why. They returned to Hertfordshire by nightfall, taking the last carriage to Branston. Magna. The village was quiet beneath the stars, lights few and far between. At the Swan and Trumpet, Miss Parnell was waiting by the fire, a letter in hand. It came this afternoon, she said, eyes wide. No return address. Just this. She handed it to Whimsy, who opened the single folded sheet. Some faces do not belong in the light. Some should remain on paper where they cannot remember. You saw her. You know now what he never understood. Please do not go further. There is danger in memory. The handwriting was careful, almost calligraphic. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. Parker looked grim. It's her, the woman from the shop. No, Whimsy murmured. Not her. Someone who knows her. Or someone watching her. He turned the envelope over. Inside, a small photograph had been tucked, one of the missing glass plates or a contact print from it. A double exposure, unmistakably, but this one featured two women, one facing the camera with a blank, expressionless stare. The other, almost transparent, stood behind her, mouth open in a soundless scream. It's not just a double exposure, Whimsy said softly. It's a confession. Parker paled. Of what? Whimsy's voice was nearly inaudible. Of being haunted, not by spirits, but by resemblance. I think someone tried to recreate a face, but the face came back too perfectly. Miss Parnell whispered. It's Rosamond, but also not. Yes, said Whimsy, and I believe the final plate, the one they didn't retrieve, may show us why. He turned, expression sharpening. We need to find where Ambrose kept his personal archive, his real darkroom, not the one in his rented cottage, the one he used when he needed privacy. Parker raised a brow. Any ideas? Whimsy was already moving to the door. Yes, we asked the one person who may have loved him, despite herself. The vicar's widow. She mentioned the attic. She mentioned the smell of chemicals in her own house once. Ambrose had access. He lived there for a summer, a quiet one, before the war, before Rosamond's death. I suspect the ghosts began there, and that's where they're waiting still. The vicarage at Branston Magna, a cheerless Victorian monolith flanked by privet and remorse, was dark, save for one window, its yellow light flickering dimly through the lace curtain, like the pulse of some wary old heart. The rain had ceased, leaving the hedgerows glistening, and a single owl called once mournfully before retreating to its shadowed roost. Whimsy knocked with two quick taps, the sound oddly muffled by the heavy oak. It was Mrs. Gregson herself who answered. She wore a plain shawl and held a half-read devotional, a sprig of yew tucked like an afterthought in its pages. Her gaze passed over Whimsy and Parker, with the resigned expression of a woman long accustomed to confidences best left unspoken. Lord Peter, I thought you might return. I rather hoped I wouldn't have to, Mrs. Gregson, Whimsy said, stepping over the threshold with a courtesy that felt theatrical even to himself. But you mentioned something that bears revisiting. The attic, Ambrose's attic. She hesitated. I told the inspector years ago. He used it when he boarded. Here? Developing plates, photographic nonsense. I thought nothing of it then. The room hasn't been opened in years. But it was opened, said Parker gently. By someone. She glanced toward the stairs. I heard movement up there once. Thought it was birds. But the lock on the attic door was broken, not forced, just picked. There was a smell too, not just chemicals, something sharper. Would you permit us to see it? Whimsy asked. She didn't speak at first, only turned slowly and led them upstairs. The stairwell creaked with every step, the walls close and clammy, papered with a faded pattern of ivy and ecclesiastical disapproval. The attic door bore a simple brass latch. The keyhole yawned. I'll wait below, she said, and left them, without ceremony. Parker produced a small torch. Whimsy pushed the door open. The room inside was larger than expected, its ceiling pitched beneath the gables. The air was thick with old dust and that unmistakable reek of photographic chemicals, acrid and metallic like ghostly breath. The furnishings were sparse. A makeshift darkroom had been arranged from blackout cloth and salvaged timber. Glass bottles lined a shelf, some labeled in Ambrose's faint, spidery script. A collapsible enlarger stood beside a metal sink, its basin still stained with dried silver nitrate. "There," Parker said, sweeping the beam of his torch across the far wall. A shallow cabinet locked. Whimsy examined it. No key, of course not, but the screws are old brass and my penknife still enjoys the occasional intellectual challenge. 10 minutes later, the cabinet swung open with the reluctant sigh of hinges unused. Inside, carefully, stored in a cloth wrap, were 3 glass negatives, unlabeled but unmistakably of recent vintage. Alongside them, in an envelope marked simply B, was a folded letter. Whimsy read it in silence. When he handed it to Parker, his face was unreadable. "To whoever finds this, do not believe what you are told. Rosamond Ferrers died twice. First, in the river, and again when her likeness returned to me in another body. I did not wish to see her again, but she came. Not as Rosamond, but with her voice, her hands, her face beneath another name. I photographed her, to be sure. The resemblance is precise beyond logic, and yet there are moments, shadows she casts that Rosamond never did. She knows things she should not, and now she is asking me to destroy what I made of her. I cannot do it. If she is what I fear, let this be a record of my refusal, a refusal to forget." "It's him," Parker said. "Ambrose." "Yes," Whimsy murmured. "And he wasn't deluded. Or rather, if he was, his delusion was unnervingly precise." Parker examined the negatives, holding them against the torchlight. The images resolved themselves slowly. One a portrait of the girl now calling herself Miss Elodie Martin. The second, nearly identical, labelled faintly with a scratched R, Rosamond. And the third, a double exposure of the two. But this one had been altered, scraped at, lines etched between the faces as if to separate them or to fuse them grotesquely. Whimsy looked away. A man haunted by a resemblance, fine. But this was something else. She came to him, not the other way round. She knew exactly who she was playing to, a widower racked by guilt, obsessed with the image of his dead wife. But he was no fool. He saw the flaws in the performance, which means she had a motive to stop him before he could reveal her. Whimsy nodded. Or before he could expose what she wanted hidden. They took the negatives and the letter with them. Mrs. Gregson accepted the news with a silence deeper than grief. She did not ask to read the letter, but insisted on walking them to the door. "I never liked the girl," she said as they left. She smiled too easily, and she watched people like a cat watches wounded birds. I knew it wasn't kindness. Back at the inn, Whimsy laid the plates out beneath a magnifier. "It's more than resemblance. The structure of the cheekbone, the narrowing at the eye. This isn't a cousin or a chance look-alike. Either this girl is Rosamond's daughter, or someone has spent years fashioning themselves into her image." "But Rosamond never had a child," Parker objected. "No official record, certainly, but a child born out of wedlock before her, marriage to Ferrers, concealed, given away. Ferrers had political ambitions, a scandal would have ruined him. And Ambrose, he'd have known, or suspected. So Elodie Martin could be... she could be a ghost," Whimsy said softly. "Not of the supernatural kind, but something worse. A living reminder of something buried. That's why she came to Ambrose, to silence his memory." Parker stared at the plates again. "So where is she now?" "Still in the village. She sent the letter. She's watching, waiting." Whimsy stood. "We'll call on her in the morning, but not to accuse. We'll ask about the photograph, about Rosamond. We'll watch how she speaks her lies. If she flinches, if she corrects, because one of those will tell us where her mask begins to slip." Parker closed the case slowly. "You think she'll crack?" Whimsy's smile was thin. "If she doesn't, she'll kill again. People who rewrite their pasts don't tolerate editors." The next morning brought with it a curious shift in the village atmosphere. A light mist hung over Branston Magna, blurring the outlines of hedgerows and causing the church tower to loom like a penitential giant behind gauze. The inn's breakfast was a stolid affair. Kedgeree and cold ham served by a landlady who glanced rather too often toward the front door, as though expecting a stranger or fearing a ghost. Whimsy tucked a folded napkin into his collar with the air of a man about to read Horace aloud to a dog. "I wonder, Parker, whether our Miss Martin rises early. There's something about photogenic femmes fatales. They either rise at dawn or not at all." Parker poured the tea, letting the silence fill the corners. "If she knows we've found the negatives, she'll be ready for us." "Oh, undoubtedly," Whimsy agreed cheerfully. "But ready in what way? That's the thing. Will she play ingenue or sophisticate? Tearful victim or cool manipulator? The role she chooses will tell us more than her words." They finished breakfast and made their way down the village lane, the soles of their shoes brushing dew from the grass-verged path. Miss Elodie Martin was staying in the guest annex of the Ferrers estate, once a coach house, now rendered passably, domestic with creeping wisteria and floral curtains that might have covered crimes in another life. A young maid admitted them, awkward, all elbows and lowered eyes. "She's expecting you, my lord," she said, and opened the sitting-room door with the reverence one reserves for the stage curtain before a star's final act. Miss Martin sat, by the window haloed in morning light. She had dressed plainly in a navy dress and soft shoes, but the effect was calculated rather than careless. Her dark hair was pulled into a modest knot, and the book in her lap, Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, was open to a page she had clearly not been reading. "Lord Peter," she said, her voice neither bright nor strained, "and Inspector Parker. What a very English morning. Mist, mischief, and the distinct feeling that one's secrets are damp at the edges." Whimsy inclined his head. "Miss Martin, you'll forgive the intrusion. I rather hoped we might talk about photography." She blinked, the slightest hesitation. "Of course, though I assure you I'm no good with a camera. Mr. Ambrose, tried to teach me years ago, but I never had the eye. But he had a very particular eye, wouldn't you say?" Whimsy said lightly, strolling to the mantel where a small black and white portrait sat beneath a dusty dome of glass. He noticed what others overlooked, faces, for instance, and resemblances. She was quiet for a moment. "You've been to the attic?" "Yes," Parker said. "We found the negatives. And the letter." A pause. Then she laughed, softly, but with that brittleness women employ when fencing with perception. "So, that's what this is." I wondered. "You think I'm Rosamond, or her shade?" "I think," Whimsy said gently, "that Ambrose Ferrers was a man haunted by guilt, yes, but also sharp. He recognized something in you that disturbed him. Whether that was memory or fabrication, we've yet to decide." She looked away, to the misted garden. "Rosamond was my mother." There was no shock in her voice, no dramatic flourish, just a steady fact laid on the table like a card from an antique deck. "Born in Brussels," she continued. "In 1904, out of wedlock. She never told my father who the man was. But I know she loved him. She gave me his middle name, Laurent. When she married Mr. Ferrers, she left me in the care of a governess. I was 7 when she died. Whimsy did not interrupt. Her tone held the cadence of rehearsed truth, not necessarily falsehood, but the kind worn smooth through repetition. "I found Ambrose by accident," she said. 3 years ago, he was in a gallery in Bath showing some of his old work. I recognized one of the portraits. It was of her. I introduced myself. At first he didn't believe me, then he grew frightened. And yet you continued to visit," Parker said. "I needed to know what she was like in the end, what her life had been, what kind of man he was. I thought I'd find stories. Instead, I found obsession." She stood then, moving to the bureau where she drew out a leather-bound case. From it, she withdrew a photograph. It was Rosamond Ferrers, unmistakably, seated beneath the same elm tree Whimsy had seen in the negatives. Her smile was quiet, her hands folded neatly. "He wanted to recreate her," Elodie said. "Through me. Not just photograph me, but dress me like her, teach me how she moved. I refused. After that he changed, became cruel. He said I was tormenting him. that I wasn't her enough. "And you stayed?" Whimsy asked softly. She turned to face him. "He threatened to expose my parentage, to ruin what little reputation I had. He said I was a fraud, but he was the one who couldn't let go." There was silence for a moment. Whimsy tapped the frame of the photograph. "That may all be true," he said at last, "but there's something that troubles me. You sent him a letter, Miss Martin, not just recently, back then. A letter urging him to destroy the negatives. It bore no kindness, no daughterly concern. It was a command. And when he refused, he died." Her expression flickered, then steadied. "I didn't kill him." "No," said Whimsy very gently. "Then how do you explain the scratches on the double exposure plate?" "That wasn't an artistic decision. That was panic. Someone trying to erase an image that proved something they feared." Her voice tightened. "He did that. He hated it." Whimsy walked to the window. "You see, the trouble with photographs, Miss Martin, is that they show not just what was, but what was never meant to be seen. Shadows, misalignments, expressions caught unguarded. If Ambrose was trying to recreate Rosamond through you, he would have chosen only the best images. But that one, the double, he kept it, hidden, because it wasn't a triumph, it was a failure, and perhaps a threat." Parker stepped forward. "We're going to have the negatives examined. If they've been tampered with, we'll know." She paled just perceptibly. "Miss Martin," Whimsy said, "if you're protecting someone, if there's more to this than a broken past, it's better to tell it now, because the image you're trying to preserve is beginning to blur, and once it fades, all that's left is motive." She said nothing. After a moment, she turned her back on them, staring once more into the garden. "Leave, please." Whimsy inclined his head, but not without one last glance at the photograph of Rosamond. He paused, squinting slightly. "She's holding something in this." "A book," he pointed. "Yes," said Elodie without turning. "A prayer book." But Whimsy shook his head slowly. "No, Miss Martin, not quite. Look closer. It's a camera manual." He tapped the glass and smiled with sudden, precise satisfaction. "And therein perhaps lies our true likeness." They left her in silence. Outside, the mist was thinning, revealing the straight line of the lane. Parker looked sidelong at his companion. "You believe her?" "I believe she believes most of it," Whimsy murmured. "But the lie isn't in what she told us. It's in what she omitted. And that is—" Whimsy's eyes were bright. "Who took that photograph of Rosamond, and why it was never meant to be seen again?" The fog had begun to lift by the time Whimsy and Parker reached the edge of the village again, revealing with stark clarity the church spire, the iron gates of the Ferrers estate, and the distant line of the woods that flanked the northern boundary. As they walked in contemplative silence, Parker kept glancing toward his companion, reading the slight tilt of his hat and the idle way his fingers traced the line of his walking stick, signs not of idleness, but of inward calculation. At last, Parker spoke. "Do you really think she didn't kill him?" "I think she might have wished him dead," Whimsy replied without turning his head. "But wishing and doing are not quite the same. Still, she's hiding something. There's a blank space in the picture she painted. Deliberate, I suspect. And you know what they say about blank spaces, old chap? They shout." He paused before the low stone wall that separated the village green from the lane, and rested one hand on it, gazing toward the distant house. "There's another player in this tableau, someone she didn't name, someone who may have taken that photograph of Rosamond, the one we found scratched." Parker nodded. "Could it be the husband, Mr. Ferrers?" "Unlikely. He was a terrible photographer by all accounts. Ambrose was. The artist in the family, not Robert. No, I wonder if it was taken after she died, perhaps even long after." Parker frowned. "You're suggesting it was staged, but the woman in the photograph is Rosamond. Or someone meant to look like her," Whimsy said quietly. "You recall the date etched faintly on the reverse of the plate, June 1921. Rosamond Ferrers died in March of that year." Parker stopped. "So the image must be of Elodie." "Exactly," Whimsy said. "And if Ambrose took that picture after her death, staging it with her daughter as a ghostly double, then he wasn't simply haunted. He was rehearsing grief, composing it, developing it, exposing it until it became unbearable." They reached the inn and were halfway through the hallway when the landlady called out from her little office, a note in her hand. "For you, my Lord, delivered not half an hour ago by a boy on a bicycle, said it came from the Ferrers place." Whimsy accepted the envelope, slit it open, and unfolded the note. It was written in a neat, slanted hand. "If you wish to understand the full picture, come to the summer house after dark. Come alone, no signature." He passed it to Parker, who read it twice. "A trap?" he asked. "Almost certainly," said Whimsy, with relish. "But I'm rather fond of traps. They have a way of bringing all the players to the same stage. I'm coming with you. You'll come part of the way. But the invitation was quite specific, and whoever wrote it knows we've seen the negatives. That narrows the field." By dusk, the clouds had turned a dusky lavender, and the trees along the path to the Ferrers estate stood in silhouette. Whimsy parted ways with Parker at the garden gate, agreeing on a whistle as a signal if things turned dangerous. The summer house stood in a clearing at the far end of the estate, half hidden by yew trees and rose thickets. Built in the late Victorian style, it had once been a place for teas and tennis whites. Now it loomed, a dark-eyed retreat where secrets might speak freely. He entered without knocking. Inside, the dimness was pierced only by a small oil lamp on the center table, and beside it stood a woman, not Elodie Martin. "You're Miss Barnum," Whimsy said softly. It was the housemaid from the Ferrers estate, the one who had let them in that morning. Her posture was rigid, hands clenched at her sides, eyes too wide. "You knew," she said, voice trembling. "You knew about the photograph." "I knew someone took it, and not Ambrose." She shook her head. "He posed them. I took it. But I didn't know what he was doing, not at first. He said, 'It was art,' said she, Miss Martin wanted it. But the way he looked at her, like she was some sort of ghost come back to accuse him." "When was this?" Whimsy asked. "Early June," she whispered. "He'd had too much to drink, said he needed to fix something that the past could be repaired with the right exposure. Miss Martin didn't want to do it. She cried, said it wasn't right. But he made her. Threatened her. Not with violence," the girl said bitterly. "With scandal. He had letters from her mother. Things that would ruin her if they got out. So she did it. Just that once. But after, he wouldn't destroy the picture. He said it proved something." "What?" "That she wasn't real. That she was just a shadow." Whimsy felt a chill slip along his spine. "Did she ever come back?" "Only once more. 2 weeks later. She went into the studio. I heard them arguing. She left, pale as death. He locked himself in after that. Until the night he died," Whimsy murmured. She nodded. "I went in to bring him tea and found him slumped in the dark room. There was a smell like burned chemicals. The developer had spilled. At first I thought he'd just collapsed, but then I saw the prints in the tray. Wet, smudged, ruined." Whimsy took a slow step toward her. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I didn't want to be blamed, and I knew Miss Martin would be questioned. I thought perhaps she had done it, or wanted to. But now I think it was someone else, someone who wanted the past to stay buried." Whimsy narrowed his eyes. "Who else had access to the darkroom?" She hesitated. "Mr. Ferrers." "Robert?" "Yes. He came back from London that morning. I saw him go in before anyone else knew Ambrose was dead. He came out white-faced and told me not to speak of it. Said it would ruin the family." Outside, a nightingale called, sudden and sharp. Whimsy turned to the door. "Thank you, Miss Barnum. You've done the right thing." As he made his way back down the garden path, the weight of the evening pressed down harder. The real question had emerged at last. Not who hated Ambrose Ferrers, but who feared what he had exposed. At the gate, Parker was waiting. "Well?" he asked. "We've got another suspect," Whimsy said grimly. "And this one isn't afraid to act." They turned back toward the village, the last light dying behind them, and with it, the fragile boundary between memory and motive. Parker said little as they walked, his brows drawn together in thought. The narrow lane stretched before them like a ribbon of shadow, and only the faint crunch of their footsteps disturbed the hush of midnight. At last, as they passed beneath the arched entry of the village square, he spoke. "So it's Ferrers now? Robert Ferrers?" Whimsy tilted his head slightly, a habitual gesture that Parker had long since learned to read as both agreement and caution. Not necessarily, but we've uncovered something he very much wanted hidden, and if Ambrose had begun to speak about it, then the motive becomes clearer, Parker finished. Not just madness or grief, fear. They entered the inn by the side door and climbed the stairs in silence. Whimsy paused only to unpin the note from the inside of his coat pocket and lay it on the desk in their room, beside the earlier negatives. He stared at the jumble of items for a long moment, then began to pace slowly. "There's still something missing," he murmured. "Something fundamental." Parker sat down. "Let's try to gather the strands. Ambrose Ferrers begins acting erratically in the months after Rosamond's death. He becomes obsessed with Elodie Martin, who resembles his late wife, and manipulates her into recreating a photograph. Not just recreating, Whimsy said softly. Reinventing, reanimating even. As if by restaging her, he could summon back something lost or suppress something that refused to stay buried. But Elodie resists. Perhaps she threatens to tell someone. Whimsy's fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the side of the desk. Or she does tell someone who had as much to lose if the truth came out. And that someone destroys the negatives, Parker added, glancing at the scorched remnants Whimsy had retrieved earlier, but misses the one you found. The one hidden behind the backboard. Because that one wasn't filed, it was placed perhaps in a moment of hesitation. A guilty relic. They were both silent for a moment, the night ticking forward with the slow creak of timbers and the soft rustle of wind beyond the shutters. Then Whimsy straightened, sudden purpose in his manner. "Come on. There's one more place we haven't looked." Parker raised a brow. "The studio?" "No," Whimsy said. "The cellar." They returned to the Ferrers' house shortly before dawn under pretense of following up a detail from their earlier inquiries. Miss Barnum, pale but composed, let them in and led them to the kitchen. Below it, a narrow set of stairs descended into a vaulted stone chamber that smelled faintly of earth and damp wood. At first glance, the cellar revealed nothing unusual. Bins of coal, dusty wine racks, broken crates. But behind the far wall, concealed by a rotting curtain, they discovered a locked cupboard. Miss Barnum looked at it with visible discomfort. "I never go near that," she murmured. "It belonged to the master." "Ambrose?" Whimsy asked. "No, Mr. Robert." Whimsy knelt, examining the old lock. With a few patient twists of his penknife, it gave way, and the door creaked open. Inside were three objects: a satchel of old letters tied with twine, a bundle of cloth containing a tarnished necklace, and a box of glass plates, photographs, neatly stored, each labeled with a date. Parker picked up one of the plates and held it to the light. "My God," he breathed. Whimsy looked over his shoulder. The image was unmistakable. Rosamond Ferrers. But not the serene, elegant woman of earlier portraits. In this frame she was caught mid-turn, face distorted in fury, hand raised. Another showed her collapsed in a chair, head turned sharply away. In a third, her figure was absent entirely, but Ambrose stood in the background, facing the lens with a strange, vacant expression. Whimsy took the box and leafed through the dates. March 1st, March 3rd, March 6th. Then, curiously, nothing until June. "Staged," Parker said again, voice low. "More than that," Whimsy murmured. This was a series, a narrative. Ambrose was telling a story through her absence. He reached for the satchel of letters and undid the twine. Inside were pages written in a looping feminine hand. He read aloud. "I write this with great difficulty, for I no longer understand the man I married. He speaks now of images, of preserving me as I was, not in memory but in light. He has filled the studio with mirrors. He says I must be still, even in my grief, that my stillness proves my loyalty. I fear he sees something in me that is no longer mine." They exchanged glances. "So she knew," Parker said. "She knew he was breaking." Whimsy nodded. "And she feared that what he saw through his lens was not a wife, but a canvas, something to remake." They took the box, the letters, and the necklace and returned to the drawing room where Robert Ferrers was waiting. He had come down for breakfast and been surprised, but not overly so, to see them. When he noticed the objects on the table, however, his complexion drained to the color of ash. "I think you'd better sit down," Whimsy said. Robert didn't move. "You have no right—" "No, but I have the truth," Wimsey said calmly. "Ambrose was not murdered for his cruelty or his madness, but for the record he kept. A record of what happened between him and Rosamond. You destroyed part of it, but not all." Robert's lips parted in protest, but nothing came out. "You feared what the images revealed," Wimsey continued. "Not merely your brother's obsession, but his confession. You went into that dark room after he died and found the prints that would have proved what Rosamond suffered. You burned them, but you didn't know about the others or the letters." Robert sank into a chair as if the strength had gone from his bones. "I thought it would end with him," he whispered. "I thought, once he was dead, it would all stop." "Did you kill him?" Parker asked. "No." He looked up. "He killed himself, but I destroyed the evidence for Rosamond, for Elodie, for what was left of our name." Wimsey's face was unreadable. "And yet, in doing so, you condemned them both to silence." Robert bowed his head. They turned over the materials to the local inspector that afternoon. No charges were brought. Ambrose's death was confirmed as suicide, but the public record was amended to include the truth, delicately phrased, of what Rosamond Ferrers had endured and what Elodie Martin had been drawn into. Wimsey stood by the station platform as the train arrived. Elodie had agreed to return to London quietly, under a new name. As the steam hissed around them, she turned to Wimsey with a half-smile. "You believe me now?" "I always believed you," he said gently. "I simply needed to prove it." She hesitated. "Do you think he loved her? My mother?" Wimsey's gaze drifted toward the rolling countryside, in his own way, but love warped by possession ceases to be love at all. It becomes something else, something far more dangerous. She nodded once, then stepped aboard. The train pulled away, carrying with it the final ghost of Rosamond Ferrers, and Lord Peter Wimsey, hands tucked into his coat, turned back toward the lane where mystery was never far and memory never quite slept. The drawing room at Holmwood Manor was dimly lit, the evening light filtering through thick curtains like a ghost reluctant to quit the scene. Lord Peter Wimsey, in a tweed suit that managed to look both unassailable and faintly theatrical, leaned against the fireplace as Inspector Prowse stood stiffly by the doorway, notebook in hand and moustache bristling with expectation. The assembled guests, the grimly pale Miss Elfrida Jarvis, the fluttering Mrs. Chudley, the morose Canon Petrie, and a now fidgeting Mr. Hammond, formed a tableau of English politesse under duress. Only Miss Verity Brackley seemed untouched by apprehension, though her eyes were fixed steadily on Wimsey, as if trying to divine where his baritone voice might lead next. "I think," Wimsey began, adjusting a poker with delicate indifference, "we can agree that the murder of Mr. Gilpin, our unfortunately expired photographer, was an act of some cunning, or at least of theatrical ambition." Prowse cleared his throat, but Wimsey continued, holding up a small, now familiar envelope. "This negative," he said, waving it lightly, "was the last Mr. Gilpin ever developed, and, had it not been for the peculiar behavior of a certain dog on the evening of his demise, we might have taken it for an aesthetic experiment in shadows and blur. Alas, even dogs, like clocks and clergymen, sometimes know more than their stations suggest." Miss Jarvis gave a small gasp, and Mrs. Chudley's fan fluttered like a moth in heat. "The dog you see barked not at a stranger, but at someone it knew, someone wearing the wrong shoes. Gilpin was in his darkroom when he died, developing this very negative. The timing was too precise, too intimate for a stranger to have entered undetected. No, this was no burglary gone wrong, nor an interrupted affair of blackmail. It was something far more intimate." He turned toward Miss Brackley. "May I trouble you to describe again the photograph you found, the one Gilpin sent to Canon Petrie?" Verity nodded slowly. "It was of the old chapel, but there was something odd, a figure in the window. I assumed it was a trick of exposure." "It was not," Wimsey replied. "It was the late Mr. Edwin Chudley, your brother, Mrs. Chudley, though of course few here had seen him in years. I compared the silhouette to a family portrait in the upstairs hall. Identical posture. Gilpin had discovered it by accident. He had taken to photographing ruins by night. For effect, But what was Edwin doing in that chapel? Mrs. Chudley stammered. He disappeared during the war. We thought him lost. Indeed, and yet he returned, if only briefly and furtively, and therein lies the tragedy. Wimsey's tone dropped a fraction. Gilpin, in developing his images, discovered proof that Edwin Chudley had come back to Holmwood and had been, how shall I put it, secreted away. Canon Petrie spoke at last, his voice gravelled with age and anxiety. But who would hide such a thing? Someone who feared what Edwin might say, Wimsey said smoothly. Someone who had something to lose from a family scandal being unearthed. A scandal like, for example, a forged will, or perhaps an inheritance passed under false pretense. Now Mr. Hammond stirred, colour draining from his already anemic face. "You're not suggesting—" "I am," Wimsey said gently. "You, sir, have lived these last 10 years under a shadow of illegitimacy. The late Mrs. Chudley, your aunt, if I may still so call her, altered her will shortly before her death to grant you Holmwood, but that alteration was contingent on Edwin's presumed death. When he returned, confused and ill, he wasn't— Well," Hammond burst out, "he was mad completely. He muttered in Latin and dug at the chapel walls like an animal. You couldn't risk him being discovered," Wimsey supplied. "So you tucked him away. You bribed Gilpin at first to keep silent, anonymously, of course. But when Gilpin grew uneasy, began muttering about moral duty and hinted to Verity he'd found a real ghost." Hammond shook his head, lips trembling. "I only meant to frighten him, just take the negative, but he wouldn't listen. He said he'd give it to the bishop. I followed him into the dark room. We struggled. He slipped." "You bashed his head against the sink," Wimsey said quietly. "Not hard, perhaps, but he died all the same. A matter of angles, tragic, really." Silence settled over the room like an old drape. Even the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to pause its ticking. "You'll find Edwin's remains," Wimsey added after a moment, "behind the bricked vestry cupboard in the old chapel. The dog sniffed at it too long for it to be anything else. And the photograph, bless the shutter's eye, caught him walking out, disoriented no doubt, before you lured him back in." Inspector Prowse stepped forward with a sigh and a pair of handcuffs that glinted like irony in the gaslight. Hammond did not protest. He merely looked down at his shoes, muttering something about inheritance and fairness, though the words lacked heat or conviction. After the man had been led away, Mrs. Chudley collapsed into a wing-back chair, muttering about ruin and scandal. Verity remained standing, though her shoulders had lost some of their defiant set. "Will it all come out, Lord Peter?" she asked quietly. Wimsey gave her a glance, thoughtful and not unkind. "Truth, Miss Brackley, has a most inconvenient way of crawling out like a beetle under a lifted stone. I dare say Canon Petrie will know how to phrase it for the parish newsletter with tact and ecclesiastical vagueness. A matter of historical interest resolved, perhaps." "And Gilpin?" Wimsey sighed and touched the brim of an imaginary hat. "A fool in many ways, but he died pursuing clarity in the dark. One might call that poetic." He took up his gloves, adjusted a slightly flattened lapel, and turned to Prowse. "I think, my dear Inspector, I shall retire to the Goat and Goose. They have a rather vile Madeira that demands my attention. Unless, of course, you would prefer to dine here and discuss photographic emulsions with the grieving," Prowse muttered. Something unintelligible, and Wimsey, with the slightest of bows to the room, exited. As he passed through the wide front hall of Holmwood Manor, the wind caught the edge of a tapestry and set it flapping softly. Wimsey paused to glance at it, a medieval hunting scene where a grey stag turned, bleeding, toward its pursuers. "Curious," he murmured. "They always paint the eyes with such human sorrow." Then, with a step light as silence and a smile too faint to reach his eyes, Lord Peter Wimsey vanished into the gathering dusk.